All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Holland & Hart webinar, healthcare webinar. Today we're going to talk about the HIPAA security rule and specifically the requirement in the security rule to perform a risk analysis or a risk assessment. My name is Matt Sorensen. I'm an associate here at Holland & Hart in the Salt Lake City office, and I've been with the firm about a year. Prior to joining Holland & Hart, I spent 15 years in private industry in information security and data privacy roles as both technologist and compliance officer, kind of a pre-law school life that I had. If you have questions throughout the webinar today, I believe you can just type them into the chat function. And Luke, if you can go into the chat function and just give me a test question so that I can see one come through and I'll know what to look for here in the interface. There we go. So if you have questions as we go through this, type them into the chat window and I'll keep an eye on that and we'll try to answer them as we go. And if there are any that are a little more complicated, I might save those for the end and then let folks drop off at the end of the webinar and I'll answer those specifically. Okay. All right, here's our standard disclaimer. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We're giving educational materials out today. If you have any specific questions, use cases to your specific situation, please seek the advice of competent legal counsel. And let's get right into this. Here are a couple sources. I put them right up front. Much of what I'm covering today is from this first source in this document. It's a bit old, but it's still very relevant. I also have another link here to the tool that we'll talk about later in the presentation, a security risk assessment tool provided by the federal government to help particularly small, medium-sized covered entities and business associates perform risk assessments, come into compliance. So just for lay of the land, I have obligatory citation to the Code of Federal Regulations. This is the site to the security rule. And as we get into this discussion about risk assessments, it's important to orient ourselves to the language of the regulation and choose carefully our definitions. If there's one area within IT and information security that has a proliferation of different definitions, it'd be the risk management area. Folks regularly confuse threats and vulnerabilities and risk and talk about them interchangeably. And when it comes to HIPAA compliance, we want to use the definitions that are given to us by the regulators and adhere and make sure that our practices and our risk assessments conform both in our understanding and in the output of our risk assessments. So the applicability of the security rule to covered entities, we're not going to spend time on that, but just a couple sites here that we're dealing with the security rule applying to electronic protected health information, or EPHI, and it is EPHI that the covered entity creates, receives, maintains, or transmits. The next part here of the general requirements of the security rule are we're looking to protect that EPHI against reasonably anticipated threats to the security and integrity of such information. Protect against reasonably anticipated uses or disclosures of our EPHI. We're going to come back again and talk more about what reasonably anticipated means and spend some time with these definitions. I want to point out before we dive into risk analysis that in these general requirements for the security rule, we have this clause, the flexibility of approach, and that is pertaining to the selection of countermeasures or safeguards. The HIPAA regulations talk about safeguards and in the industry we often talk about controls or countermeasures. Controls is a little more popular with the IT auditors, but certainly safeguards is the HIPAA taxonomy. The choice of the controls or the security safeguards that we make, how we choose them, are subject to reasonable and appropriateness. And so if we're a small covered entity and we have an IT staff of 1 or 2, and most of our EPHI is contained in one primary system, then we may do our risk assessment and begin to select safeguards that are reasonable and appropriate to our size and our scale. And so what we cover today in this presentation is going to be, it applies to large and small organizations and covered entities alike, so don't feel overwhelmed with how am I going to apply all of this in my small operation or environment if you are small. Remember, coming back and thinking through this reasonable and appropriateness measure can give you some assistance as you are designing and looking to improve your program. How do we know what's reasonable and appropriate for our covered entity? Our size and complexity, as I mentioned, what kind of technical infrastructure, hardware we maintain and software, what our security capabilities are at present, and what they should be as determined by our risk assessment, and the cost that we face, and the probability and criticality of the risks. Again, the results of our risk assessment help us understand what is reasonable and appropriate for us. And then just a final note here under this 164.306, the security rule is defined by standards and implementation specifications. We're not going to get into the standards and the implementation specifications except for the one that deals with the risk analysis, and I believe that should be next here. So 164.308, under the administrative safeguards, we have a standard, the security management process, and a couple different implementation specifications under that standard. Risk analysis is what we're here to talk about. And we can define this in a million different ways and still be correct, but only one definition matters, and that's what the regulators define it as and how it's defined here in the regulation. So we're required to perform a risk analysis, which is to conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our EPHI. A lot of key words there. We're going to talk about risk, we're going to talk about vulnerabilities, we're going to talk about threats, and we're going to talk about the form and practice of doing a risk assessment. So we're talking about one implementation specification out of many, many in the security rule. And I'll highlight one mistake that's common when covered entities perform their risk assessment is they will do what's known as a gap assessment or a gap analysis by stacking up all the different standards and the implementation specifications under each of those standards in the security rule. And they will then analyze whether they're meeting or they have a gap in meeting that particular specification. That's not the risk analysis as contemplated by this particular requirement. It's a wise compliance activity to perform to see where you measure up, how you measure up, what your strengths and weaknesses are in a more holistic compliance sense, assessing your compliance to the security rules, individual controls or safeguards, implementation specifications. But a risk assessment contemplates some very specific things. And the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, has been clear about what those things are. My choice of this presentation today was largely predicated on a conversation I had with an employee of the OCR who regularly does post-incident investigations of covered entities. And she shared with me that it's routine for her to find no risk assessment at all at covered entities that have suffered breaches. and instead a misunderstanding amongst management and compliance professionals that in fact a gap assessment is what they were considering risk assessment. So I want to just cover this in a way that makes a clear distinction between the common practice of doing gap assessments erroneously as a risk assessment. Okay, so let's move on. Again, this is just a nod as we're moving in here. This requirement here in HIPAA requires documentation, and of course we want to document our risk assessment as we do it so that we have proof, have an audit trail. And what I showed here is just an image I found on the internet that shows someone's Gantt chart of a risk assessment project. And I liked how they have cleanly delineated the pieces of the risk assessment, and we're going to get into these, in the different elements, the different steps, the procedure of doing a risk assessment, and then they've mapped that out across time. So at a high level, you know, we say, in the OCR, in their documentation, say that the risk analysis drives or feeds the overall risk management process. And it is that risk management apparatus that forms the basis or the foundation of the safeguards protecting the EPHI. And so certainly we do the risk analysis in order to find out where we start with safeguard selection. And then periodically, as we both encounter new threats in the environment, new technologies that we acquire and use, we adjust our safeguards as a consequence of performing or refreshing our risk assessment. And that activity, holistically, is the risk management process. So in the document that I cited, the very first, at the beginning of this, the OCR guidance document on risk assessments, they have this disclaimer. It's the CMS frequently asked question on the security rule. So they point to the NIST standards as a source for covered entities and business associates to use in designing, building, operating the compliance apparatus, their security program. And the NIST standards, I'm going to mention them, apply to the federal government and are publicly available for all of us to use. But they say here that, you know, you don't have to use NIST standards. We're merely pointing them out as a guidance for you to use. In fact, some of these NIST standards may be too big, too complex for the small organizations as they were intended. I'm going to show them to you anyway at a very high level, just to give you, if you don't already know about them, a place where you can go and see fairly detailed breakdown of what NIST believes are processes for both risk management and risk assessment. And then you can scale it down as appropriate for your organization. So the three NIST standards in particular are these three. These are in the Special Publications Series 800, SP 800, and they're numbered 30, 37, and 39, and starting with the highest level down to the more detailed. 800-39, Managing Information Security Risk, is very high level, and it basically is a model where an organization can not only manage compliance risk, be it HIPAA or other compliance risk, but any kind of enterprise risk. And so the key is to frame your operating environment in a way that allows you to conceptually discover and manage risks, in particular, through this process of assessing, responding with safeguards, then monitoring those safeguards and monitoring your operational environment for changes, and then reassessing periodically. And it's a cycle. You complete the cycle as often as needed, annually, quarterly, and so forth. Details on this model can be found in the citation at the bottom. The next standard, 37, is a little more detailed risk management framework that a company can use to and this would be pertinent to, say, a risk officer, compliance officer, and so forth. Now, I do want to add that these 3 NIST standards are obligatory for federal agencies under the FISMA law, Federal Information Systems Management Act. And it may be a little cynically, you know, when you see the details and you begin to understand the complexity of applying these kinds of standards to what are certainly diverse and complicated federal information systems, it may beg the question, does this really help? Does this really make the federal information systems more secure? We know that federal information systems suffer data breaches, and they all have been striving to be FISMA compliant, presumably, for years. So the lesson here is not that applying these NIST standards will prevent all breaches, but what they will do is give you a defensible position upon which to base your compliance activities. If a data breach occurs, we would rather be able to show that we have done what reasonable compliance officers would have done, and the breach happened despite our best efforts, and that will lead to better outcomes over the long term than if we had failed to do a risk assessment in the first place and lacked critical controls that would have been put in place by anyone doing the reasonable job. So risk management framework here in 837, you see step 1 rounding around to step 6. Again, like the higher level standard we saw previously, there's a little more detail in how the federal government is supposed to manage risk and information security, and it can be a guide to the rest of us. We categorize our information systems and our information, such as we classify it as highly confidential or restricted or a PHI, and then we select the controls to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability, implement those controls, assess them, and monitor them. That authorization, step 5, is a piece of the federal certification and accreditation process that is not common in private industry, at least in those terms. So moving on, next one is really the meat of risk assessment, and we're going to spend time talking about some of these key words in here. So the 800-30 risk assessment standard outlines high-level 4 steps, but you'll see that the meat of this is in step 2, conducting the risk assessment. So step 1, we prepare. Step 2, we conduct the assessment. Step 3, we communicate results. Step 4, we maintain it. And again, presumably this is a cycle that we repeat. Step 2, we see 5 steps inside step 2. Identify threats, identify vulnerabilities, determine likelihood, and determine impact. Those are the 4 ingredients of a risk assessment as prescribed both in these NIST standards as well as in the OCR's guidance to covered entities. And if in the past you may be thinking to yourself, our risk assessment that we've done previously never really talked about or dealt with likelihood of occurrence. That's very common. Again, feedback from the OCR that I've received is that if we lack these 4 key ingredients in our risk analysis or our risk assessments, it is not a true risk assessment as required under HIPAA. There are vendors out there in the country that will sell HIPAA risk assessments to clients and don't cover these 4 ingredients. And you may ask, well, why? How could that be? And I believe some of the reason is that there's been a long-running debate in information security in the profession, outside of HIPAA more generally, about the role of risk management and about the feasibility of claiming to even do risk management. And while it's interesting and academic and somewhat engaging to get into those debates and research the sides, the opposing viewpoints because that is a educational way to get into the details. HIPAA doesn't care about that. HIPAA says do a risk assessment. The OCR says here's how we do risk assessments, and these are the expectations. And so what we want to focus on, of course, is executing our duties and in spite of some of the noise out there. So if you do use a third party to help you with your annual risk assessment, have a frank conversation with them, review this standard, 800-30, and some of the other materials from the OCR's website, and talk to them about including these 4 ingredients. And some of them are difficult, as we'll see. Okay, so moving past the NIST standards, again, this just puts them in the context of what we talked about. The risk analysis, the standard 830 is where it applies, and the 37 and the 39 are higher level risk management standards. Okay, so risk definitions. Let's get into the brass tacks. Vulnerability, a flaw or weakness in a system. It could be in a process, but it's something that, if exploited, leads to a bad outcome. We may have vulnerabilities in people, because people are susceptible to trickery or social engineering. We certainly have vulnerabilities in networks, in protocols that our systems talk with across those networks, and we have vulnerabilities in software and operating systems. Threats. Typically we think of threats as people, bad guys, but they can also be things. The definition here from NIST is the threats are the potential for a person or thing to exercise a specific vulnerability. And whether it be by accident or on purpose, the threat, here it says triggers or exploits a vulnerability. So again, while it's common to think of people, we need to keep in mind and not be too close-minded that threats include things like natural disasters, things that can cause the cycle that end in a reportable incident or a breach. Threats also, I think, are often interchangeably used with vulnerabilities. The loose language doesn't help us in our compliance efforts, threats, vulnerabilities, and it helps to keep them cleanly defined in an internal policy, for example, in an information security policy. And whether you use the NIST definitions or come up with one that you feel is more easier to understand, because these NIST definitions can sometimes be academic, the goal here is to decide on a definition and stick with it. And it can be a challenge to keep executives and senior leadership using these words properly, but just do your best, and it'll save you a little bit of headache later. Risk. And let me just close on threat by saying threat here, NIST says, is a potential. I think threat actors is really what we were talking about. It's the actual agent that is bringing the threat to pass. So risk here, again, a little bit of military language, the net mission impact. Really, risk is the probability that a particular threat will come together with a particular vulnerability and cause something bad to happen, an impact, something with an impact. So it can be intentional and it can be accidental, but it requires a threat and a vulnerability to come together. Okay, so vulnerabilities, in simplified language here, a flaw or a weakness, a threat, person or thing that exercise a vulnerability. And then the risk here, again, you'll see the loose language in the NIST standard. It says the combination of the likelihood and impact of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. We can change out combination of with other phrases that may feel better or make more sense. You know, it's a function of the likelihood and impact. In our roles, in the role of a compliance analyst, It's an estimation of, certainly it's an estimation of the likelihood and impact. In hindsight, after a risk has been manifest, certainly we can get hard facts about likelihood and impact. If it occurred, the likelihood was 100% after the fact. But one thing I don't like here, risk, is a calculation of the likelihood and impact. And as we'll see, calculating risk is difficult. Certainly if we're trying to do it with a quantitative approach, get into the math of risk and probabilities. And it's easy to go down that rabbit hole, especially when we're earlier in our careers or earlier in our understanding of information security risk. Some folks out there believe it can be done, some don't, and that leads into those debates I mentioned earlier. The good news is that we're not required under HIPAA to do mathematical probabilistic calculations. Reasonable belief in, that's probably my favorite one. It best comports with legal standards of due care, and what would a reasonable person believe based on experience and based on the recent trends in the industry, in the healthcare IT industry, and what is foreseeable. What does our experience tell us is possible and in fact probable? Okay, so as we get into the details of doing our risk assessment, we're going to focus on threats and vulnerabilities. Once we come up with those pairs of threats and vulnerabilities in a generic way, then we'll move into the impact and the likelihood. But first, let's talk about threats. Again, human threats, natural threats, environmental threats, all contemplated under HIPAA. Vulnerabilities in technology, and some examples here, people, we talked about that, and processes. I've seen vulnerable processes. Imagine a process where two clerks or secretaries share one computer and share the same login and password to do their jobs. And that's a process they've been asked to follow that has a fundamental flaw. It's a vulnerable process because of the sharing of the password and user account. So filling in and catching up, looking at our diagram, the risk management process there on the left, and then the risk analysis steps from the standard 800-30 on the right, 1 through 8. And I just put in the administrative, physical, technical safeguards up above, just to kind of give us a roadmap and see how one activity leads into the other. So these steps, these 8 steps of risk analysis, we're going to talk about these in turn here. Identify the scope of the analysis. So we want to make sure we have a grasp that we haven't left anything out. It's becoming very common for what we call shadow IT to grow into an organization, and that would be a business unit that finds a nice software as a service product or a cloud service, and they just go sign a contract and start using it without telling IT. Smaller practices may be solely based on an outsourced solution, but at least it's the main solution that's known about and procured in the right way. So what we want to start with is inventories. We want to consider not only all of our EPHI, what are we collecting, but where are we putting it, and how are we processing it, and where are we sending it, and where do we retrieve it from. We want to make sure that not only are we thinking about confidentiality, but also integrity and availability. Gathering data, and this is also going to talk about inventories. Devices, mobile devices, workstations, laptops. And you all are well familiar with these fines from the OCR against covered entities that have lost PHI on laptops. And it's becoming more expensive. You know, even small entities are being fined, you know, upwards of $1 million and more for the loss of laptops with unencrypted PHI. And it begs the question, if there is a business need to have PHI on a laptop, it should be encrypted. because the penalties for losing an unencrypted laptop with PHI are too high. You know, the cost of the encryption of those devices versus the potential fines is fractions of a penny on the dollar. How else can we gather our environment and our inventory? We do interviews, we review documentation, we review past projects to get our scope as accurate as we can get it. Okay, identify and document potential threats and vulnerabilities. So when we think about threats in the information security world, we often have this hierarchy in terms of skill and funding and motive. At the top are nation states. We're all familiar with these allegations of Russia tampering with our election. And whether it's true or not, it's something that nation states have the capability to do. And the rule of thumb is that if a nation state wants to do something by way of a hacking, it's going to do it because of the funding and the talent and the resources available. As we go down this list, organized crime all the way down to opportunist, the resources decrease, skills generally decrease. And I tagged on insider threats there at the end because they are a very real issue to deal with as well. This acronym here, SCRAMO, let me explain that. It comes from an old security practitioner, long since retired, named Don Parker, and it stands for skills, and these are the attributes of a human attacker, a human threat agent. Skills, knowledge, resources, access, authorization, motivation, and opportunity. And I like to have a matrix where we list out the different actors that may be a threat to our PHI, to our covered entity, and then I rate them. You can rate them across this SCRAMO categories, and then you can rack and stack them, rank them in terms of a priority. You may have nation-state actors with very high levels of skill and resources, but a very low motivation. And certainly no access and authority. So it tries to balance out some of the competing factors. Your insider threats, you may have an insider threat with access and motivation, but low skills. So take that and see, have fun with that one. I like SCRAMO. It's been a help in many cases for me personally. You can also come up with these similar kinds of characterizations of natural environmental threats as well as non-human. All right, vulnerabilities. So once we've done a reasonable job of our threat analysis and categorizing threats and ranking them, we need to know what our vulnerabilities are. Again, it's easy to think of the vulnerabilities in our technology, and how do we find those? Well, we scan, we test, we have penetration testers come and look for vulnerabilities. Our IT administrators should be subscribed to threat feeds, bulletins. If you're using Oracle, you want to be sure you get the emails from Oracle about their upcoming patches and so forth. But we also can't overlook the vulnerabilities in our people. We know phishing is a big problem, and phishing is caused by vulnerable people. And how do we find vulnerable people? Well, we can test them, we assess them, we put up signs, posters. There are tools. Some of you may use the phishing tools where you phish your own employees as part of a training exercise. And if they click the link, they get a screen that says, you should not have clicked that link. Here's a quick training to take. We also have vulnerabilities in processes, as we discussed. And this is just good old-fashioned business process analysis and doing it with an eye to compliance. All right, so we've got a catalog of vulnerabilities and a vulnerability management. Hopefully we have some sort of vulnerability management function. And now we put that information together and assess our current security controls, our safeguards. How are we defending ourselves against these vulnerability and threat pairs that we have documented? And again, these come in all sorts and shapes and sizes, and there's a big list of them in the security rule under those implementation specifications. Some of them are preventive, corrective, detective. This is IT audit language for control categorization. Some of them are manual, done by people. Sometimes they're a hybrid of an automated access report, for example, and a manual review to detect access that should no longer be granted or allowed. When we are looking at our safeguards and whether they're sufficient, IT auditors typically approach it in two ways, sequentially. First, test of design. You ask the question, is this safeguard designed to meet the goal? If we want to roll a wagon, we need round tires, not square. And while that's maybe a poor example, that's the concept of test of design. If we have an access report, is it complete? Is it covering all of the access tables that need to be reviewed? If not, and it's only covering a couple, then that's a design flaw, and the report needs to be redesigned to include the proper scope. The effectiveness is done once we know that the control is designed properly. And effectiveness is a determination of, is this control working? If the control is an access report with a manual review, we test for effectiveness. We would look at the results and see if we can find any defects, any output that has slipped through the cracks. Are there people still with access who shouldn't, even after the manual review? That would be an indictment on the effectiveness of that access review. How do we test for effectiveness? In many ways, we can sample output, and this is, again, not to get into the discipline of IT audit, but this is, we inspect the controls, the output. We can feed known aberrations and see if they're detected. If it's detective control, much like the TSA does when they slip knives and things through security to see if they can get through, to test the detective capabilities. All right, so now having come through a threat analysis, a vulnerability, output of a vulnerability management process, and a baseline of what controls we have in place, we now look to combine our results and think about likelihood and impact. And again, this is where it can get a little bit difficult, but primarily because we just can't predict the future. But what we want to do is stick with qualitative measures of impact. If possible, dollar amounts, quantitative dollar amounts are good. Scores work. So the traditional impact is low, medium, high, and we don't need to worry about a deep precision here. What we're trying to do is rank a group of existing risks one to another. So we determine what our reasonably foreseeable risks are first, our threat vulnerability pairings, and then we just take that body, that list, and rank them with impact. Low, medium, high. You know, if we have a record count and we can say, here's the dollar amount that it would cost if we lost the entire health record database versus maybe we have at most no more than 500 records on any given laptop, but they're encrypted. Those are dollar amounts that you can draw back and use in this impact analysis as well. Really the same thing with likelihood. Low, medium, high is common, and likelihood is the least amenable in our industry, I think, to quantitative calculations. Qualitative is how the literature from the OCR and the NIST standards specify likelihood in terms of qualitative measures. So I want to just talk about a magazine story on the financial crisis from 2008. The March 2009 cover of the Wired magazine had this snapshot here I put on the right. The secret formula that destroyed Wall Street. And this is a formula that really was underpinning some of the mortgage-backed securities. And It's much more complicated than this. This is a summary of the formula. But essentially that Greek letter with the line down the middle, I think it's gamma, that really was a variable to hold a probability that the asset that was being securitized, in this case the houses, would decline in value or appreciate in value. And that number representing whether those houses would decline in value was set very, very, very low, meaning the real estate will just keep going up forever. And of course, as we know now, that when the housing market turned down, the whole thing came apart and all these mortgage-backed securities fell apart and we had this big financial crisis. And I point this out just as an illustration that even Wall Street quants or quantitative experts, that this isn't an exact science. And I think it's a cautionary tale of an over-reliance on math to determine likelihood and probability. And so, again, what we're trying to do as HIPAA professionals is foresee reasonably anticipated threats and hazards. And how can we be reasonably informed? We read the news, we stay abreast, we get training, we get certifications, certified HIPAA professionals, certified information systems auditors, information security certifications, and so forth, to become aware and educated about the most common threats, the most common attacks, and therein lie answers to what are the reasonably foreseeable threats and vulnerabilities. And then addressing those with reasonable safeguards. If you have time, I put the link here to that article. It's a fascinating read. So this is a sample output, very basic 3x3 matrix, risk matrix. You've got likelihood up the side and impact along the bottom. And this is a common way to illustrate risks that are the product of our assessment. We've looked at vulnerabilities and threats, and we've combined them into pairs of reasonably foreseeable risks. And then we've determined the likelihood and impact in an imprecise but reasonable way to determine this risk level. We can document that in a couple different ways. Here's just a very simple action plan where we take all the critical risks, list them. So I'm a covered entity and I've done my risk assessment, and let's say I've got 12 risks, or maybe I have 212, but I've tried to put them in this context of the risk matrix, and now I want to list all the critical in one spot, then the highs, and so forth. And this is just a list format. Item 1, risk 1, a critical risks. What's the solution? What's the risk description, and then what's the solution or options we have? What are the costs, and how are we going to address it? What's the due date? This is the kind of information that we then take into senior management meetings and begin discussions on risk management at that high level. Another way to do this, well, there are several, and there are a lot of different examples online, and there's a tool that we'll talk about in a couple slides here, risk assessment tool that provides a report format for you at the end. Okay, so we've mentioned briefly some of the confusion between risk assessments and gap assessments. What is not considered a risk assessment by the OCR when they come and investigate a data breach at a covered entity? They do not want to see your gap assessment against all the technical safeguards, administrative safeguards found in the implementation specifications of the security rule. That's an important compliance step and tool, but it's not a risk assessment, which is one requirement under the administrative safeguards. Your risk assessment should look as we've discussed and include those 4 key ingredients. A list of threats and corresponding safeguards is a start to a good risk assessment according to the OCR, but you need to add the likelihood and the probability. Again, they mentioned to me that the risk assessments often fall short, either because they completely omit likelihood and impact, or they didn't contemplate it very much at all. And in the context of their operation. So we want to show a deliberation in our documentation of our risk assessment, and that includes the preparation and the scoping, how we identified all EPHI, noting any inventories that we have maintained. Even if they're point-in-time inventories or spreadsheets of devices, it helps build the risk assessment. And then, of course, the identification of the threats and the determination of likelihood and impact. Write it down and keep it together in your risk assessment documentation. Common mistakes: failure to account for third-party risk. Particularly with these new SOC reports, they're not new anymore, but they've replaced the old SAS 70s, keeping in mind that when you use a third party to store, process, or transmit EPHI, and you have a business associate agreement with them, if they try to provide you with a SOC 1 report, don't accept it as sufficient, as enough, because a SOC 1 report has a different function. It's to show you that the financial reporting controls at that service provider are sound, not the data processing and security controls. Yes, there's some overlap. Some of the security controls matter in the SOC 1, but you need to demand of your service providers SOC 2 reports. And if they try to pass off SOC 1 on you, call them up and say, look, we need the SOC 2, and if you don't have one, when are you going to get one? And to the best of your ability, only do business with those entities that can produce or have a commitment to obtaining and maintaining a SOC 2 report. Also, the SOC 2 report isn't your answer to your risk assessment. If you're wholly outsourcing your computing environment to third parties, and you can't just get the SOC 2 reports from each of the third parties and say that you're done. Other mistakes, common errors, we've said this before, no risk assessment at all, leaving out the likelihood and impact steps, and then there's no way to show what management did with the risk assessment in some cases, in many cases. So making sure that there's some record that what's the decision process. A lot of companies will, if you have a risk assessment and then you have a data breach, having nothing to show for your efforts in responding to the identified risks can work against you when your regulators come to visit. So in conclusion here, I just wanted to point out this risk assessment tool available at healthit.gov, and it's got some variations. There's a paper version, there are Windows, there's an iPad version, and I'm interested if anyone's had experience with this tool, what your experience is. Send me an email. And of course, if you use the tool, it's no guarantee that you'll use it right, or that the output from that tool is going to guarantee a passed HIPAA audit. But it is something, certainly for a smaller entity, is certainly a good starting point, going through the user guide and seeing how this tool tries to help you manage those 4 key ingredients of the risk assessment: vulnerabilities, threats, likelihood, and impact, can help you on your way to improving these risk assessments overall. All right, last slide, just some action items. Hopefully you've got some ideas from today. It may spark a few things to improve on. Immediately, identify when your next risk assessment is due, and then review your last risk assessment. See how it compares to some of the things we talked about today, and identify any gaps, identify ways you can improve the next risk assessment. And then in the next 30 days, as you come back to work in January, set to work on gathering the information that you may have lacked at the last risk assessment. Go to work on the inventory issue, or begin communicating with superiors about the need to improve your risk assessment. And then longer term, take those measures and steps to do a better job of identifying, documenting, and contemplating and making sure it's all documented. And with that, I believe we're here at the end. We've got some time for questions, and you can type them in. If you want to drop off, go ahead and drop off. Thank you for attending. Appreciate it. I hope this was helpful. And I don't know if Luke or anyone else is going to sign on, but if you drop now, have a Merry Christmas, good holidays, and stay safe. Thank you very much. I'll hold for questions. Go ahead and type your questions into the chat window, and I'll just respond.